The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Appalachian Heritage Archives in Asheville, North Carolina, casting long shadows across rows of storage boxes that held more than a century of forgotten stories. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses as she carefully lifted the lid from a container marked Hawkins County Religious Collections 1890 to 1905. The musty smell of old paper and aging photographs filled her nostrils, a scent she had grown to associate with discovery after 15 years of historical research specializing in rural American communities of the late 19th century. Sarah had dedicated her career to uncovering the hidden narratives of Appalachian life, those stories that never made it into official records or grand historical texts. She believed deeply that understanding the past required looking beyond the surface of preserved documents, searching for the subtle details that revealed the true human experiences of people long gone. Her work had taken her through countless archives, church basements, and family attics across Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky, and West Virginia, always seeking those fragments of authentic life that could illuminate how ordinary people navigated extraordinary times. The photograph emerged from layers of protective tissue paper with an almost ceremonial quality. It measured approximately 8 by 10 inches, mounted on thick cardboard that had yellowed with age but remained remarkably intact. The image itself possessed that peculiar clarity that early glass plate photography could achieve, capturing details with an almost startling precision that later film could rarely match. Sarah positioned it under her desk lamp, and the scene came into sharp focus. At first glance, the photograph appeared to document a typical Sunday gathering at what the handwritten notation on the back identified as the Covenant Creek Baptist Church in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. The church building itself stood proud in the background, a modest wooden structure with a simple steeple pointing toward an overcast sky. Approximately 30 people were arranged in neat rows in front of the church, their Sunday finest on display despite the obvious poverty that marked the region during that difficult economic period. Women wore dark dresses with high collars and long sleeves, their hair pulled back severely. Men stood in worn suits that showed careful mending, their faces bearing the weathered look of those who worked the unforgiving mountain soil. Sarah had examined hundreds of similar photographs during her career, documenting the religious and social life of Appalachian communities. These images typically followed predictable patterns, with congregations posed formally, facing the camera with expressions ranging from solemn pride to barely concealed discomfort at being photographed. The pastor usually occupied a central or prominent position, a visual affirmation of his authority and role in the community. But something about this particular image nagged at her attention, an almost imperceptible wrongness that she could not immediately identify. She leaned closer, using a magnifying loupe to examine individual faces in greater detail. That was when the peculiarity revealed itself with startling clarity. Every single person in the photograph, without exception, had turned their face away from the figure standing at the center of the back row. The man at the center wore the distinctive collar and dark suit of a pastor. His posture suggested authority, his position in the photograph indicating his importance to the gathering. But while he stared directly at the camera with an expression that seemed to combine pride and something else Sarah could not quite name, every other face in the image was turned away. Some looked to the left, others to the right, several gazed downward at the ground. A few appeared to be staring off into the distance beyond the frame. The effect was subtle enough that a casual observer might miss it entirely, but once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. The arrangement was far too uniform to be accidental. In group photographs of this era, people occasionally looked away due to distraction or the long exposure times required, but never with this kind of coordinated precision. This was deliberate, a silent statement captured in glass and silver salts. Preserved across more than a century, Sarah felt the familiar thrill of discovery that had drawn her to historical research in the first place. Here was a story waiting to be uncovered, a moment of human drama frozen in time, speaking across the decades to anyone willing to listen carefully enough. She carefully photographed the image with her high-resolution camera, capturing every detail, then turned her attention to the sparse documentation that accompanied it. The collection had been donated to the archives in 1994 by the estate of Martha Hensley, a descendant of one of the founding families of Hawkins County. The accompanying paperwork provided minimal context, noting only that the items represented materials gathered from the closure of various small churches throughout the region during the mid-20th century, when rural depopulation and consolidation had led many mountain communities to abandon their historic places of worship. Sarah spent the remainder of that day cross-referencing the Covenant Creek Baptist Church in county records, census data, and regional historical societies. The church had been established in 1876, serving a small but apparently stable congregation in an isolated hollow approximately 15 miles from the nearest town. By 1920, the church no longer appeared in denominational directories. The building itself had burned down in 1903 under circumstances that the brief newspaper account described simply as accidental fire, no injuries reported. The 1900 census provided names of families in the Covenant Creek area, though without more specific information, Sarah could not definitively identify the individuals in the photograph. She made notes of the names that appeared most frequently, family groups of Hensleys, Carvers, Prestons, and Madisons who seemed to form the core of the community. One name appeared in the records with particular prominence: Reverend Josiah Blackwell, listed as the pastor of Covenant Creek Baptist from 1895 through 1899. That the timeline intrigued Sarah. The photograph was dated 1898, placing it near the end of Blackwell's tenure at the church. Something had happened during that year or shortly after, something significant enough that it had been captured in this striking image, yet apparently not dramatic enough to leave clear traces in official records. The story had been buried either deliberately or simply through the passage of time and the death of those who remembered. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the archive floor, Sarah began constructing a preliminary timeline of events. She noted that 1898 had been a year of significant national upheaval, with the Spanish-American War dominating headlines and the country experiencing the tail end of a devastating economic depression that had begun in 1893. Rural areas had been particularly hard hit by this depression, with agricultural prices remaining depressed and access to credit severely constrained. Mountain communities, already operating at the margins of the cash economy, would have felt these pressures acutely. Sarah also recognized that the late 1890s marked a critical period of transition for Appalachian communities more broadly. The region was increasingly being viewed by outside interests as a resource frontier, rich in timber, coal, and other extractable commodities. Land speculation companies had been active throughout the mountains for decades, but the pace of actual development and resource extraction had accelerated dramatically in the final years of the 19th century. This acceleration brought profound disruption to communities that had developed relatively stable patterns of subsistence agriculture, hunting, gathering, and local exchange over many generations. The photograph before her represented a moment caught in the midst of these larger historical currents. But Sarah knew that understanding those broad patterns could only take her so far. What she needed was to understand the specific human experiences and conflicts that had produced this remarkable image. The faces turned away from the pastor were individual people with names, families, histories, hopes, and fears. Their collective decision to make this silent statement had emerged from particular circumstances and relationships that she would need to reconstruct through patient investigation. Sarah closed the archive that evening with a sense of purpose crystallizing in her mind. She would find out what had happened at Covenant Creek Baptist Church in 1898, why an entire congregation had turned away from their pastor in what should have been a simple commemorative photograph. The answers lay somewhere in the fragmentary records of that isolated mountain community, waiting to be pieced together by someone willing to dig deep enough. As she drove home through the mountain twilight, she thought about those faces in the photograph, frozen in their moment of quiet resistance, and felt a growing sense of responsibility to tell their story as fully and faithfully as the surviving evidence would allow. The research began in earnest the following week, with Sarah dedicating her time to tracking down any surviving records related to Covenant Creek and its inhabitants during the final years of the 19th century. She reached out to colleagues at universities across Tennessee and North Carolina, contacted local historical societies in Hawkins County, and began the painstaking process of reviewing microfilmed newspaper archives from regional publications that had served the area during that period. The Appalachian region in 1898 existed in a state of profound transition and tension. The mountains had long been isolated, their communities developing distinctive cultures and practices largely independent from broader American society. But the final decades of the 19th century brought accelerating changes that would fundamentally alter mountain life. Timber companies had begun aggressive harvesting of the region's vast forests, bringing wage labor and outside ownership to areas that had previously operated on subsistence farming and local exchange. Coal mining operations were expanding, transforming landscapes and social structures. Railroads pushed deeper into previously inaccessible hollows, connecting mountain communities to national markets and national problems. These economic changes created fractures within communities that had previously maintained strong social cohesion through shared hardship and mutual dependence. Traditional patterns of communal support and informal economic arrangements came into conflict with the demands of wage labor and market integration. Churches, which had served as the primary social and moral centers of mountain communities, found themselves navigating increasingly complex questions about how their congregations should engage with these transforming circumstances. Sarah discovered that Reverend Josiah Blackwell had not been a native of the Covenant Creek area. He had arrived in 1895 from Knoxville, sent by the Southern Baptist Convention as part of a broader effort to strengthen denominational ties with rural mountain churches. His background suggested education and urban sophistication that would have set him apart from his congregation. The sparse biographical information Sarah could locate indicated he had attended a Baptist seminary and had previously served churches in more developed areas before accepting the Covenant Creek assignment. The contrast between Blackwell and his congregation would have been significant. Mountain people of that era were often portrayed by outside observers as backward and ignorant, though Sarah's research had taught her that such characterizations masked sophisticated forms of knowledge and community organization adapted to the specific challenges of mountain life. The arrival of an educated, denominationally trained pastor in a small mountain church likely represented an attempt to bring these communities into closer alignment with broader Baptist practice and theology, an effort that did not always proceed smoothly. A breakthrough came when Sarah located a series of letters in the archives of the Tennessee Baptist Convention. The correspondence dated from late 1897 through early 1899 and included several communications from Blackwell himself, reporting on his work at Covenant Creek. The early letters expressed optimism and described a congregation that welcomed his leadership. But the tone shifted dramatically in letters from mid-1898 onward. In August of 1898, just months after the photograph would have been taken, Blackwell wrote to his denominational superiors expressing frustration with his congregation's resistance to what he described as necessary reforms. He complained that church members continued to practice what he called irregular forms of worship, including extended periods of emotional singing, spontaneous testimonials, and healing prayers that he believed lacked proper theological grounding. He noted with particular disapproval that members frequently sought the counsel of an elderly woman in the community, someone he referred to dismissively as maintaining superstitious practices regarding healing herbs and community mediation. Sarah recognized this pattern from her broader research. Mountain religious practice in this period often blended formal denominational Christianity with older folk traditions rooted in Scots-Irish and other European backgrounds, creating distinctive forms of spiritual expression that educated clergy from outside the region sometimes viewed as problematic. The tension between formal theological training and locally adapted religious practice represented a common source of conflict when denominational organizations sought to standardize worship across diverse communities. Further investigation revealed more about the specific circumstances at Covenant Creek during 1898. County court records showed an unusual spike in land disputes and debt cases involving members of the Covenant Creek community during that year. Sarah cross-referenced these with her list of names from the census and found that nearly every family represented in the area appeared in some form of legal or financial difficulty during the period. The economic crisis affecting the community had a specific cause. A timber company based in Pennsylvania had purchased harvesting rights to thousands of acres of mountain land in the area, including property that many local families had used for generations under informal arrangements with absentee landowners. When the timber company began operations in early 1898, they disrupted hunting grounds, polluted streams with sawdust and debris, and restricted access to areas where local people had traditionally gathered nuts, berries, and medicinal plants that supplemented their limited agricultural production. Several families faced eviction from land they had occupied and improved for decades but to which they held no formal title. Others found themselves pressured to take wage labor with the timber company at rates they considered exploitative, while simultaneously losing access to the natural resources that had previously provided economic security. The situation created deep anxiety and conflict within the community, challenging traditional patterns of life and threatening the viability of continued residence in the area. Sarah found evidence that the congregation at Covenant Creek Baptist had looked to their church for guidance and support during this crisis. This was consistent with the historical role of mountain churches as centers not just of religious life but of collective decision-making and community solidarity. Church meetings often served as forums for discussing shared problems and determining collective responses to external threats. But Reverend Blackwell, according to his own correspondence, had counseled his congregation to accept the changes as inevitable progress and to focus on individual spiritual development rather than collective resistance to economic transformation. He had preached sermons emphasizing acceptance of earthly authority and the importance of directing attention toward heavenly rather than worldly concerns. He had discouraged what he viewed as excessive emotionalism in worship, arguing that such practices distracted from proper Christian teaching. The correspondence revealed that this counsel had not been well received. Blackwell reported that attendance at Sunday services had declined significantly by fall of 1898. Church members who had previously been active in leadership roles had become withdrawn and uncommunicative. He noted with frustration that prayer meetings and midweek services that had once drawn strong attendance now proceeded with only a handful of participants. Most significantly, Sarah discovered a letter from November 1898 in which Blackwell described a confrontation during a church business meeting. He had proposed that the church sell a small plot of land it owned to the timber company, arguing that the proceeds could support church operations and perhaps fund improvements to the building. The proposal had been unanimously rejected by the congregation, and several members had apparently questioned whether Blackwell truly understood or represented their interests. The photograph from earlier that year now took on new meaning. Sarah recognized it as likely having been commissioned to mark some church anniversary or special occasion, a common practice for congregations wanting to document their community at a particular moment. But the uniform turning away of faces from the pastor captured a reality that formal documentation would otherwise have hidden. It was a statement, preserved with remarkable clarity, of a congregation's loss of confidence in their spiritual leader, made at a moment when they were compelled by social custom to stand together for a commemorative image but unwilling to pretend a unity they no longer felt. Sarah also discovered records of individual families that helped her understand the human cost of the conflicts playing out in Covenant Creek during 1898. The Preston family, for instance, had farmed a small plot of bottomland along the creek for nearly 40 years. Census records showed steady growth over the decades, with children born, marriages celebrated, and eventually grandchildren added to the household. But court records from 1898 revealed that the family faced eviction because the absentee owner had sold the land to the timber company without notifying them or honoring their long occupancy. Another family, the Carvers, had operated a small sawmill serving local needs, cutting timber from their own property and from neighbors who traded labor for lumber. The arrival of the industrial-scale timber operation threatened to put them out of business entirely, unable to compete with the efficiency of the company's equipment and organization. The head of the Carver household had sought advice from Reverend Blackwell about whether it would be morally acceptable to sabotage the company's operations, a conversation that Blackwell had reported to his denominational superiors with considerable alarm. These individual stories began to paint a picture of a community under enormous pressure, watching their established ways of life being systematically dismantled by economic forces they had little power to resist. The church had been their natural gathering place to discuss these challenges and seek both spiritual comfort and practical guidance. When their pastor offered neither meaningful support nor even validation of their concerns, the rupture that appeared in the photograph became almost inevitable. Sarah spent hours poring over additional correspondence and records, building a detailed timeline of events and relationships. She discovered that the timber company had employed tactics common to such operations during this period, using legal technicalities to dispossess long-term residents, paying wages that were barely sufficient for survival while requiring workers to purchase overpriced goods from company stores, and responding to any organized resistance with threats of blacklisting or worse. She also found evidence that some community members had attempted to organize collective action against the company. A petition had been circulated in the summer of 1898, signed by heads of households representing most of the families in the Covenant Creek area, demanding that the company respect traditional access rights to hunting and gathering areas, pay fair wages, and negotiate in good faith with families who had occupied land for generations. The petition had been ignored entirely by the company, which was legally within its rights to do so given the property arrangements that prevailed. The failure of this petition had apparently been a turning point for the community. With legal and peaceful approaches proving ineffective, and with their pastor counseling acceptance rather than continued resistance, the people of Covenant Creek faced increasingly stark choices about their future. Some began to make plans to leave, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Others grimly accepted wage work with the timber company on whatever terms were offered. A few spoke of more direct forms of resistance, though Sarah found little evidence that such plans were ever carried out in any organized way. Throughout all of this turmoil, the photograph stood as a singular moment of collective expression. Whatever disagreements might have existed among congregation members about how to respond to their circumstances, they had apparently achieved unity on at least one point: their pastor had lost their confidence and trust. The silent statement captured in that image represented one of the few ways available to them to make their feelings known without risking the complete dissolution of their community or inviting retaliation from external authorities who would certainly have sided with educated clergy over illiterate mountain farmers. Sarah's investigation took her beyond archival research and into the field. She traveled to Hawkins County in early autumn, when the mountains blazed with color and the air carried the sharp clarity that comes with changing seasons. The modern landscape bore little resemblance to the world of 1898, with paved roads cutting through areas that had once required hours of difficult travel, and scattered development replacing what had been isolated farmsteads and tight-knit hollows, but traces remained for those who knew how to look. Sarah had contacted the Hawkins County Historical Society, and they connected her with local people who maintained an interest in the area's past. She met with descendants of the families who had lived in the Covenant Creek area, now scattered across the county and beyond, many having left the mountains decades earlier in the great outmigration that characterized Appalachian history throughout the 20th century. One particularly valuable connection came through Martha Preston Collins, a woman in her late 70s whose great-grandmother had been among the congregation photographed in 1898. Martha lived in a tidy house on the outskirts of the county seat, surrounded by gardens that showed the careful attention of someone who understood mountain-growing traditions. She welcomed Sarah with the kind of hospitality that Appalachian culture has long valued, offering coffee and homemade biscuits while they talked on a screened porch overlooking rolling hills. Martha had grown up hearing stories about the old days at Covenant Creek, passed down through her grandmother who had been a young woman during the events Sarah was investigating. While the specific details of the photograph and the conflict with Reverend Blackwell had not been explicitly preserved in family stories, the general outline of that difficult period remained part of family memory. The community at Covenant Creek had been close-knit in the way that isolated mountain settlements necessarily were, depending on mutual aid and shared labor to survive in an environment that offered few easy paths to prosperity. Families had intermarried across generations, creating dense networks of kinship that reinforced community bonds. The church had served as more than just a place of Sunday worship. It was where disputes were mediated, where collective decisions were made about road maintenance or school operations, where young people met and courted under the watchful eyes of elders, where the sick were visited and the bereaved were comforted. Martha explained that her great-grandmother had spoken often about an elderly woman named Granny Hensley, someone who had served as a healer and counselor in the community. This matched the dismissive reference in Blackwell's correspondence. Granny Hensley had been born in the early years of the 19th century and had accumulated decades of knowledge about medicinal plants, midwifery, and the kinds of practical wisdom that sustained life in the mountains. She had also served as someone people turned to for advice about family conflicts, property boundaries, and community decisions. When the timber company crisis developed in 1898, Granny Hensley had been in her 90s but still sharp-minded and influential. According to family stories, she had counseled the community to resist the timber company's encroachment through whatever legal means they could muster, to maintain solidarity in refusing unfair wage rates, and to preserve their access to the mountain resources that sustained their way of life. She had framed this not as backward resistance to progress but as defense of their rights and their ability to maintain dignified independence. This council had stood in direct opposition to Reverend Blackwell's advice to accept the changes and focus on spiritual rather than worldly concerns. The conflict between these two sources of authority had created a crisis within the congregation. Many church members felt torn between respect for their educated pastor and their deep trust in Granny Hensley's wisdom, which was rooted in generations of mountain experience. Sarah learned that the photograph had indeed been taken to commemorate the church's founding anniversary in the spring of 1898. By that time, the tensions within the congregation had already become apparent, though they had not yet reached the breaking point that would come later in the year. The decision by church members to turn their faces away from Blackwell during the photograph had been spontaneous, a collective and silent statement that emerged in the moment without prior planning. Martha's grandmother had described it as an act that felt both rebellious and necessary, a way of expressing their feelings without directly confronting their pastor in words that might create an irreparable breach. In the culture of mountain communities, indirect communication and symbolic gestures often serve to manage conflict while preserving the surface unity that small communities needed to maintain. The photograph captured a moment of profound disagreement expressed through body language and symbolic positioning rather than explicit confrontation. Sarah visited the site where Covenant Creek Baptist Church had once stood. The location was now deeply overgrown, accessible only by a rough trail that wound through second-growth forest. The timber company had clear-cut the area in the early 20th century, and the forest that had returned bore none of the massive old-growth trees that had once defined the landscape. The church site itself was marked only by a depression in the ground where the foundation had been and a scattering of stones that might have been part of the building's underpinning. Standing in that quiet place, Sarah tried to imagine it as it had been in 1898. The small wooden church with its simple steeple, the surrounding community of modest farms carved into the mountainside, the paths connecting households whose inhabitants knew each other with the intimacy born of shared struggle and mutual dependence. She thought about the people who had gathered here week after week, seeking spiritual sustenance and communal support, and about how the arrival of economic forces beyond their control had created tensions that even their shared faith could not easily resolve. The autumn wind rustled through the second-growth forest, and Sarah found herself moved by the silence of the place. A community had existed here, dozens of families building lives and raising children, celebrating marriages and mourning deaths, working the land and maintaining traditions passed down from earlier generations. All of that had been swept away, leaving barely a trace in the physical landscape. Only through documents and photographs and the fragmentary memories preserved in family stories could their existence be recovered and understood. Additional research revealed what had happened after the photograph was taken. Reverend Blackwell had resigned his position at Covenant Creek Baptist in February 1899, citing what he termed an irreconcilable difference of vision between himself and the congregation. He returned to a church in Knoxville and later moved to a larger pastorate in Nashville. His subsequent career showed no obvious scars from the Covenant Creek experience, and he apparently never wrote about it publicly. Sarah found his obituary from 1924, which described him as a respected minister who had served numerous congregations throughout Tennessee and had been active in denominational affairs. The brief biographical sketch mentioned his education and his various postings, but made no reference to Covenant Creek. It seemed that from his perspective, that difficult experience had been simply an unfortunate mismatch between an educated minister and a congregation not ready for his guidance, something best forgotten rather than examined. The congregation at Covenant Creek had continued without denominational support, returning to more traditional mountain patterns of worship and community organization. They had called an older man from their own community to serve as pastor, someone without formal training but deeply rooted in local culture and trusted by the members. The church had survived until the building burned in 1903, an event that several sources suggested might have been deliberately set by timber company operatives as retaliation for the community's continued resistance to their operations. though this was never proven to be why. 1905, most of the families from Covenant Creek had dispersed, some moving to nearby towns to take industrial work, others relocating to maintain farming lifestyles in less disrupted areas. The community that had existed there for nearly 30 years simply ceased to be, scattered by economic forces that made their traditional way of life increasingly untenable. Granny Hensley had died in 1900, reportedly at the age of 97. Martha told Sarah that family stories described her final years as difficult, as she witnessed the dissolution of the community she had helped sustain for so long. But those same stories emphasized that she had never counseled surrender, maintaining until her death that mountain people had a right to preserve their way of life and that resistance to exploitation was both morally justified and practically necessary. Sarah also learned more about specific individuals in the photograph through conversations with Martha and other descendants. One woman in the front row had been pregnant at the time the photograph was taken, expecting her 5th child. She had given birth just weeks later, but the infant had died within days, a tragedy all too common in mountain communities where access to medical care was extremely limited. The loss had come during the height of the community's crisis with the timber company, compounding personal grief with collective anxiety about the future. Another man visible in the photograph had been known as particularly skilled in traditional crafts, making furniture and tools that were prized throughout the region. The timber company's operations had destroyed many of the specific types of trees he relied on for his work, particularly black walnut and cherry that grew in the old-growth forest. His craft had required not just skill but also intimate knowledge of where to find appropriate materials, knowledge that became worthless once the forest was clear-cut. Within 2 years of the photograph, he had been forced to give up his craft entirely and take wage work that he found deeply unsatisfying. These individual stories added texture and depth to Sarah's understanding of what the photograph represented. The faces turned away from Reverend Blackwell belonged to real people experiencing real suffering and dislocation. Their silent statement had been born not from mere stubbornness or backward thinking, but from a clear-eyed understanding that their pastor did not share their interests or values in ways that mattered profoundly to their survival and dignity. Martha shared one particularly poignant detail that her grandmother had preserved. On the day the photograph was taken, the weather had been threatening rain, and there had been some discussion about whether to proceed with taking the image or postpone to another Sunday. The photographer had been traveling through the area and might not return for months, so the decision was made to proceed despite the gray skies visible in the photograph's background. The overcast conditions had actually helped produce the even lighting that allowed the image to capture such clear detail, a small irony that the subjects could not have known at the time. The decision to turn away from Reverend Blackwell had apparently happened in the moment, without explicit prior discussion. As the photographer prepared his equipment and arranged the subjects, congregation members had simply found themselves unwilling to face the same direction as their pastor. The photographer had reportedly noticed the unusual arrangement and asked if everyone was comfortable with their positioning, but no one had responded to the question. He had proceeded with the exposure, capturing what would become a remarkable historical document. Sarah returned to Asheville with a much fuller understanding of the photograph that had first captured her attention. What had seemed like a curious historical oddity now revealed itself as a powerful document of social conflict, cultural collision, and the complex tensions that accompanied economic transformation in rural America at the turn of the 20th century. She spent weeks writing up her findings, contextualizing the Covenant Creek story within the broader patterns of Appalachian history during this period. The photograph became the centerpiece of an article she published in a regional history journal, and later formed the core of a museum exhibit on mountain communities and social change. But beyond the academic outputs, Sarah found herself reflecting deeply on what the story meant in human terms. The people in that photograph had been facing circumstances largely beyond their control, trying to navigate between competing authorities and conflicting visions of their future. They had used the tools available to them, including the silent statement captured in that image, to express their agency and their dissent. Reverend Blackwell had not been simply a villain in this story, despite his antagonistic role. He had likely believed genuinely that his counsel represented the best path forward for his congregation, that accommodation to economic change was both inevitable and ultimately beneficial, and that focusing on spiritual matters would provide more lasting value than resisting material transformations. His education and denominational training had given him certain kinds of knowledge and perspective, but had also perhaps blinded him to the legitimate concerns and valuable wisdom present in the community he served. The congregation had not been simply backward-looking or resistant to all change, despite how they might have been characterized by outside observers. They had been defending something real and valuable: their ability to maintain dignified independence, their access to resources that sustained their material lives, their right to participate in decisions that affected their community, and their own forms of cultural and spiritual expression that had developed over generations of mountain life. The conflict captured in that photograph represented a version of tensions that would play out across rural America throughout the coming decades as traditional communities confronted the accelerating pace of economic and social transformation. It raised questions that remained relevant more than a century later about how communities balance continuity and change, about whose knowledge and authority count when decisions are made, and about how ordinary people exercise agency in the face of powerful forces largely beyond their control. Sarah arranged for high-quality reproductions of the photograph to be made available to descendants of the Covenant Creek families. Several expressed deep appreciation for finally understanding a piece of their family history that had been obscured by time. Martha Preston Collins in particular was moved to see the faces of her ancestors and to understand more fully the circumstances they had navigated. The Historical Society in Hawkins County created a small memorial at the site where Covenant Creek Baptist Church had stood, acknowledging both the community that had existed there and the forces that had scattered it. Local school groups began visiting as part of lessons on regional history, learning to look at that photograph and understand the story it told about resistance, dignity, and the complex human realities that official histories often overlooked. Sarah also pursued what had happened to some of the individuals identifiable in the photograph. One family had relocated to Detroit in the 1920s, where descendants still lived, working in automotive manufacturing. The transition from mountain farming to industrial wage work had been difficult, but the family had maintained connections to Appalachian culture through music, food traditions, and periodic returns to the mountains to visit relatives who had remained in the region. Another branch had moved west to Oklahoma, continuing farming in new environments. They had joined the stream of migrants seeking cheaper land and new opportunities in the early 20th century, carrying their mountain ways into the prairies and adapting their practices to radically different environmental conditions. Descendants spoke of how their ancestors had maintained certain traditions even in their new home, particular ways of preparing food or celebrating holidays that marked them as mountain people even generations after leaving Tennessee. Some families had stayed in the general region, adapting to the new economic realities of the 20th century while maintaining connections to mountain culture and identity. They had taken factory work in nearby towns, or found employment in the expanding coal industry, or pieced together livings from various sources that allowed them to maintain some connection to the land. Their experiences illustrated the complex negotiations that characterized Appalachian life throughout the 20th century, as people sought to maintain cultural continuity while engaging with economic forces that demanded substantial adaptation. The photograph's power, Sarah realized, came from its unique combination of apparent simplicity and profound meaning. At first glance, it looked like countless other images of rural congregations from that era. But careful attention revealed a moment of collective statement, a silent but unmistakable expression of dissent and dignity. It showed people asserting their agency in the only way available to them in that moment, using body language and symbolic positioning to communicate what they could not or would not say directly. Sarah thought often about the unnamed photographer who had captured this image. Had they noticed what was happening, the coordinated turning away of faces? Had they understood its significance, or simply focused on the technical challenges of getting a clear exposure with the equipment and methods available in 1898? The photographer's perspective was lost to history, but their work had preserved a moment of profound meaning that spoke across more than a century. Historical research revealed that the photographer had likely been one of several itinerant professionals who traveled through rural areas during this period, offering services to churches, families, and communities that could afford the expensive commemorative images. These photographers played important roles in documenting rural life, though their work was often viewed primarily as a commercial service rather than as historical documentation. Many of their images had been lost or destroyed over the decades, making the survival of the Covenant Creek photograph all the more remarkable. The story of Covenant Creek Baptist Church and its 1898 photograph became something Sarah returned to often in her teaching and writing. It served as a reminder that careful attention to historical sources could reveal hidden depths, that marginalized communities had often found ways to express their perspectives and exercise their agency even when conventional power structures seemed to exclude them, and that the past remained relevant to understanding present challenges. The photograph itself, that striking image of 30 people with every face turned away from their pastor, continued to provoke questions and discussion. Whenever Sarah presented it, viewers invariably noticed the peculiarity once it was pointed out, and most found themselves moved by the silent statement it represented. It had become a window into a particular moment of mountain history, but also a broader reminder about the complexity of human communities, the inevitability of conflict, and the many ways people find to assert their dignity in difficult circumstances. Sarah's work with the photograph and the Covenant Creek story attracted attention from documentary filmmakers and journalists interested in Appalachian history. She collaborated on a short documentary that combined the photograph with readings from the correspondence and archival materials she had uncovered, interviews with descendants, and footage from the site where the church had once stood. The film premiered at regional history conferences and was eventually broadcast on public television stations serving the Appalachian region. The documentary brought the story to a much wider audience and prompted additional descendants to come forward with family stories and artifacts that added further detail to the historical picture. One family produced a handwritten diary kept by a woman who had been part of the Covenant Creek congregation, offering a rare first-person perspective on the events of 1898. Though the diary did not mention the photograph specifically, it documented the growing tensions with Reverend Blackwell and the community's struggles with the timber company in entries that Sarah found both moving and illuminating. Another descendant provided a letter written in 1902 by a man who had been among the congregation members in the photograph. Writing to a cousin who had already left the area, he described the burning of the church and the scattering of the community with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He wrote of feeling that their way of life had been destroyed not by any failing of their own but by forces they had been powerless to resist, and he expressed hope that in relocating to a town where he would work in a textile mill, he might at least provide better opportunities for his children. These additional materials enriched Sarah's understanding but also complicated it in important ways. The story was not simply one of a community united in resistance against external threats, but rather of people navigating complex and often contradictory pressures while trying to maintain both their material security and their sense of dignity and autonomy. Their choices had been constrained by circumstances, but within those constraints they had found ways to express their values and assert their perspectives. Years after her initial discovery, Sarah received a letter from a historian in West Virginia who had encountered her article about Covenant Creek. He described finding similar patterns in other mountain communities during the same period, suggesting that the tensions captured in that photograph were far from unique. Economic transformation, cultural conflict, and the collision between local autonomy and external authority had created similar dynamics across the Appalachian region, though few had been documented as strikingly as in that single image from a small church in eastern Tennessee. The correspondence led to a broader collaborative project examining mountain communities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing specifically on how ordinary people navigated and responded to the massive economic and social changes of that era. The Covenant Creek photograph became an iconic image for this work, reproduced in books and exhibits, always accompanied by the story Sarah had worked so hard to uncover. The collaborative project brought together historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and folklorists working on various aspects of Appalachian history and culture. Through sharing research and perspectives, they developed a richer and more nuanced understanding of the period and its significance. The Covenant Creek story illustrated patterns visible across the region but also highlighted the importance of local variation and specific circumstances in shaping how communities experienced and responded to change. Sarah found particular satisfaction in seeing how the story resonated with contemporary audiences, many of whom recognized parallels to their own experiences of economic displacement, cultural conflict, and struggles to maintain community in the face of powerful external forces. The photograph and its story spoke to timeless human concerns about dignity, autonomy, and the right of communities to participate in decisions affecting their futures. In the end, what had begun as a curious discovery in a dusty archive had grown into something much larger, a recovered piece of history, a reminder of human dignity and resistance, and a lens for understanding the complex tensions that shape communities facing unwanted change. The faces in that photograph, turned away from their pastor in silent but unmistakable statement, had finally been heard across the decades, their story told to new audiences who could recognize in it echoes of their own struggles with authority, identity, and the preservation of community in the face of powerful transforming forces. The peaceful-looking image had indeed concealed a deeper story, one that spoke to fundamental questions about power, dignity, and the ways ordinary people make their voices heard even when circumstances seemed to silence them. Sarah's patient investigation had allowed those voices to be heard again, demonstrating the enduring value of careful historical research and the importance of attending to the subtle details that reveal the full complexity of human experience across time. The photograph remains in the archives in Asheville, available to researchers and descendants who wish to see it. But through Sarah's work, it has also taken on a life beyond its physical existence, circulating as a digital image and as a story told and retold in classrooms, museums, and documentary films. It has become part of how people understand Appalachian history, and more broadly, how they think about the relationships between communities and external authorities, between tradition and change, between the powerful and those seeking to maintain their dignity in the face of power. For Sarah, the photograph and the story it contained represented the best of what historical research could achieve. Not just the recovery of facts about the past, but the restoration of voice and agency to people whose perspectives had been marginalized or forgotten, and the connection of past experiences to present concerns in ways that enrich understanding and provoke reflection about enduring human challenges.